Hello, today I'm going to be discussing the rise of China as an economic superpower, the relationship that was formed with the United States, and how the relationship between these two major powers was fractured and led to the current tensions today. So, starting with some background on China. In the 1970s, China was a country suffering from poverty and isolation. The people were very poor. They did not trade much with um, the other countries, and the Chinese government had to rescue its people from poverty, and the way that they decided to do this was they committed to building their national wealth by selling manufactured goods to the world, by becoming a global supplier. And in 2001, China made a massive step when they joined the World Trade Organization, and in doing this gained global access to its ports in exchange for opening its own markets to foreign competitors. And the United States was very excited about this inclusion, championed this decision at the time. And this quote from President Clinton saying, before he left office, China is not merely agreeing to import more of our products, it is agreeing to import one of democracy's most cherished values, economic freedom. So there was this idea that, in the background of what President Clinton is saying here, that while China is selling the U.S. their products, their goods, the U.S. is in turn selling them the idea of a free market society, economic freedom. And I'll come back to that quote a little later. But now the U.S. and China enter into this extremely important relationship for the global supply chain. Over the next 2 decades, the Chinese imports to America grew, they multiplied fivefold to $504 billion per year over these 2 decades. And the reason for this is that China is the ultimate way to cut costs. They produce the cheapest goods. You think of a company like Walmart, which is the hallmark of low prices. Walmart went from spending $15 million to $49 million on Chinese products in about a decade. And these were products that working American families could afford, and this was very important for the working class in America as the spending power of American families was boosted 2% per year between the years 2000 and 2007. So now you have these two massive economies that are both intertwined in a symbiotic relationship. And these two polar opposite countries, one is a free market capitalist, the other is ruled by authoritarian communist regime, both seem to be meant for each other. The Chinese people were lifted from poverty because of this trade agreement, and the Chinese government bought trillions of dollars in government bonds. And so this was a relationship that was mutually beneficial to both countries. But not everything was perfect, of course. Now, the cheaper goods from China helped American families deal with a period of stagnant wages for a time. But of course, when you invest so much into Chinese production, American manufacturing takes a massive hit. In fact, from 1999 to 2011, there were 1 million manufacturing jobs lost in America, and 2 million more jobs lost in the broader economy due to this trade with the Chinese. So you have these towns that used to be massive factory towns falling into despair and joblessness. Now, there was the Trade Adjustment Assistance that was created to compensate for these job losses with cash and training for other jobs. But most of the people who lost these jobs were not given the sufficient help. In fact, fewer than 1/3 of the eligible Americans were not helped because of insufficient funds for the program. So this became a massive issue in U.S. politics. Both President Trump and Biden have spoken about the need to invest more in American manufacturing. This was actually a big point for Trump that helped him get into office. He called this the greatest theft in the history of the world, talking about the idea that China was now stealing American manufacturing jobs. And Biden has also said that less dependence on China would make the U.S. economy more resilient. So when you have these major leaders speaking out against China, the American sentiment over China became very bitter, very negative pretty quickly. And there were more problems that came from China too, not just the effect on American manufacturing. China was breaching the rules of international trade. Um, Chinese companies were evading environmental and labor laws by sharing profits with local officials so they wouldn't crack down on them. There were barriers in place to competition from foreign companies. If you remember, part of that World Trade Organization agreement was that they would be free markets for foreign companies to come in, but China was actually preventing that from happening. And also, very importantly, those that invested in China were subject to intellectual theft and counterfeit products. One example of this is that foreign automakers used to have to team up with Chinese car companies to gain access to the Chinese market. But what happened was these same car companies took the knowledge of these foreign automakers and used it to take markets back from the foreign automakers. And so in addition to this, China expanded their military capabilities, menaced areas like the Philippines, and instead of a free market, President Xi Jinping amplified the power of state-owned companies and cracked down on the private sector. They had state-owned banks that are lavishing credit on the largest state-owned companies, which really prevents the private sector from really competing. So this is pretty much the reverse of what President Clinton said when China first made the agreement to join the World Trade Organization. In fact, it was the opposite of selling the idea of economic freedom to China. They really amplified the power of the government and government-owned companies during this time. And so this gives rise to the major political tensions that we see today. According to The Economist, the current atmosphere is laced with intimidation and paranoia. The best case is decades of estrangement, and the worst case is war, with war actually becoming more and more likely as time goes on. The US is currently accelerating military containment of China. The goal is to slow Chinese innovation and force China to back down. They've been enacting tough embargoes on semiconductors and other goods coming from China. And the US also has military alliances in Asia, making China feel encircled in their own sort of natural sphere of influence. And the president, Xi Jinping, calls this American bullying, says that China sees themselves as the weaker party and they refuse to back down and be held down by America's guardrails. Xi Jinping also believes that the West is in decline, and there's this sort of there's this need for both countries to appear tough to their people. Something that comes to mind is the Chinese spy balloon controversy, where the U.S. shot down a Chinese balloon, and the Chinese government proceeded to mock after that. The goal of all this is that the U.S. wants to weaken China's grip on sensitive industries. But with such different worldviews, there's going to be a long way to go for peace. So what is the effect? What effect does this have on the global supply chain? So the map of global trade is being completely redrawn. The US has started trading with Mexico and Canada more than China for the first time in over 2 decades. Right now, the current preferred trading partners of the US are Mexico, Taiwan, and Vietnam. And the hope is that these partners can eventually replace trade with China. And there has been a massive reduction in trade with China. 51% of low-cost Asian trade came from China last year, which is down from 66% 5 years ago. And also Chinese imports of advanced manufacturing products declined 14% from that same time span. But America still relies on China heavily, even if they don't mean to. The trade links between America and China are very deep, and they still endure today in more complicated forms. The reason for this is that American allies are trading more with China. Mexico is importing $300 million in intermediate parts per year. And demand for finished products in other countries just means increased demand for those intermediate parts in China. So the U.S. allies that they're trading with are really acting in some ways as packaging hubs for what are effectively still Chinese goods. And this is simply a way for China to avoid the massive tariffs on their goods. Because goods are 10% more expensive in Vietnam and 3% more expensive in Mexico in comparison to if we were just to get them straight from China. And while Chinese imports of manufacturing products declined 14%, Taiwan and Vietnam actually gained the greatest market share, and they import from China. So economists have warned that even a marginal shift in production will lead to higher costs for consumers, of course, because again, China is the ultimate way to cut costs. And paradoxically, America's desire for weaker relationship with China has led to our allies gaining stronger relationships. And so here's a chart of these countries that have improved in the market share in terms of trading with the United States, but the problem is that most of these companies do business with China and they import from China. And so that's what I mean when I say that these are essentially repackaging Chinese goods. So the long-lasting effects of this sort of trade battle going on between the US and China is that China's part in the global economy has diversified. This redirection in trade has slowed their economy to an extent, but China is finding new ways to diversify. They're more important to the Association of Southeastern Asian Nations now. Increased exports to those countries, and 7% of exports from those nations come from China or have some sort of manufacturing done in China. Specifically, electronic exports from China to Southeastern Asian nations up 80%, a massive improvement. In the European Union, China went from providing 3% to 10% of auto parts, which is more than any country outside of the EU. And it's the countries that had the strongest ties to China before this redirection in trade have benefited the most. Many outside firms are panicking because of the frayed relations between China and America, and they're pursuing China +1 strategies in order for them to diversify. So what all this really means, the biggest takeaway is that China's supply chains still matter to the US. The relationships still exist with China. It's just that in more steps and in more complicated paths are the United States citizens still getting these Chinese goods.